The Air Force general stopped mid-sentence when Jake mentioned Colonel Brennan's name, her hand gripping the desk as if the floor had disappeared beneath her. She had dismissed him as just a grunt 5 minutes ago, but now her carefully constructed authority crumbled under the weight of a past she thought no one knew. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. You were just a grunt. The words hung in the air of the pristine office like a verdict, sharp and dismissive. Master Sergeant Jake Reeves stood at attention in front of the polished mahogany desk, his uniform pressed to perfection, his posture ramrod straight despite the exhaustion that had settled into his bones after a double shift on the flight line. The woman behind the desk, Brigadier General Victoria Hartman, didn't even look up from the file she was reading. Her perfectly manicured finger traced down the page with a kind of clinical detachment, as if she were examining a specimen rather than a human being's entire career. The office itself was a monument to achievement. The walls were covered with framed photographs of fighter jets in formation, commendations from 3 different presidents, and a prominent display of the Distinguished Flying Cross. The afternoon sun streamed through the Venetian blinds, casting bars of light across the general's face, making her expression even harder to read. Not that Jake needed to see her face to understand the contempt in her voice. He had heard that tone before, many times, from many officers who looked at enlisted personnel the way someone might look at the help. Jake's hands were clasped behind his back, his fingers interlaced so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. In his right palm, hidden from view, he clutched a small pink hair tie, the kind with a tiny plastic butterfly attached to it. It was his daughter Emma's, and she had slipped it into his pocket that morning before school with a whispered promise that it would bring him luck. He was 6 years old, with his late wife's bright green eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. She was also the reason he was standing in this office, fighting for something that shouldn't have required a fight at all. General Hartman finally looked up, her steel gray eyes meeting his for the first time. She was in her early 50s. With short auburn hair styled in a severe cut that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Everything about her screamed efficiency, from her spotless uniform to the way she held herself with the rigid certainty of someone who had never been told no. She had flown combat missions in 2 wars, commanded 3 different squadrons, and had a reputation that preceded her like a weather front. People didn't cross Victoria Hartman. They simply got out of her way. 18 years of service, she said, her voice flat and neutral as if she were reading a grocery list. Maintenance, logistics, ground operations. Not a single hour of flight time. You've been fixing planes, not flying them. Her eyes flicked back to the file. And now you want special consideration for the officer candidate school because you're a single parent. She said the last 2 words with a subtle curl of her lip as if the concept itself was distasteful. Tell me, Sergeant Reeves, why should the United States Air Force invest in training someone who will inevitably be distracted by daycare pickups and parent-teacher conferences? The question was designed to provoke, to expose weakness, and Jake felt the hot flash of anger in his chest, but he had learned long ago to keep his emotions locked down tight. A skill that had served him well in the military and even better in the 2 years since his wife Rachel had died. He took a slow, measured breath, the kind they taught in stress management course, and kept his voice steady. With respect, ma'am, he began, his words careful and precise. I've never missed a shift. My performance reviews are excellent. I've been running the night maintenance crew for 3 years without a single major incident. My being a single father has never interfered with my duties. In fact, it's made me more disciplined, more focused. I know how to manage my time and prioritize what matters. General Hartman leaned back in her leather chair, the springs creaking softly. She folded her arms across her chest, her ribbons and medals catching the light. It's a very pretty speech, Sergeant, very rehearsed. But let me tell you something about the real Air Force, the one that exists outside of your maintenance hangar. Officers don't work 9 to 5. They don't get to leave early because their kid has a dance recital. They deploy at a moment's notice. They spend months away from home. They sacrifice everything for the mission. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. You were just a grunt, Reeves. You're used to taking orders, following procedures, turning wrenches. You have no idea what it takes to lead, to make life or death decisions at 30,000 feet, to carry the weight of command. And frankly, I don't think you have what it takes. The words landed like a physical blow, each one carefully chosen to wound. Jake felt his jaw tighten, felt the muscles in his neck cord with the effort of maintaining his composure. He wanted to tell her about the nights he had spent studying leadership manuals and flight theory after Emma had gone to bed. He wanted to tell her about the correspondence courses he had completed, the flight simulator hours he had logged on his own time and dime, the letters of recommendation from 3 different colonels who believed in him. He wanted to tell her that being a grunt, as she so dismissively called it, had taught him more about leadership than any classroom ever could. You learned to lead from the ground up. You learned what mattered to the people who actually made the mission happen, but he said none of those things. Instead, he simply replied, I understand your concerns, ma'am. I'm asking for a chance to prove myself. General Hartman's expression didn't change. She closed the file with a decisive snap and placed it in a tray marked denied. Your application for OCS is rejected, Sergeant Reeves. You're dismissed. She had already turned her attention to her computer screen, her fingers moving across the keyboard. The meeting was over. Jake felt something crack inside him, a fragile hope he had been nurturing for months. He had believed, truly believed, that merit mattered, that hard work and dedication counted for something. But standing in this office, being reduced to just a grunt by a woman who had never once asked about his qualification, his achievements, or his dreams, he realized that the system he had devoted his adult life to serving had a glass ceiling for people like him, people who came from nothing, people who didn't have the right connections or the right background, people who made the mistake of caring about something other than the mission. He saluted, a crisp, perfect gesture that was automatic after 18 years. General Hartman barely glanced up, offering a lazy return salute without even looking at him. Jake turned on his heel and walked out of the office, his boots silent on the carpeted floor. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality. The hallway outside was empty, the kind of oppressive quiet that fills military buildings in the late afternoon when most people have already gone home. Jake walked slowly toward the exit, his mind reeling. He passed walls covered with portraits of distinguished officers, men and women who stared down at him from their frames with expressions of stern accomplishment. Not one of them, he thought bitterly, had started out as just a grunt. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the Texas heat. The sun was brutal, turning the parking lot into a shimmering mirage. He stood there for a moment, letting the heat wash over him, trying to process what had just happened. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Chun, who watched Emma after school. She had sent a photo. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, carefully coloring a picture. She had drawn two figures, one big and one small, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Underneath, in her careful 6-year-old handwriting, she had written, "Me and Daddy, best team." Jake stared at the photo, his throat tight. He had to be okay. He had to figure out another path forward, because Emma was counting on him, and he refused to let his daughter down the way the Air Force had just let him down. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, touching the small butterfly hair tie one more time. Then he walked toward his truck, his shoulders squared, his head up. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. And General Victoria Hartman had no idea who she was dealing with, because Jake Reeves might have been just a grunt, but he was a grunt who had learned something that no amount of flight training could teach. He had learned how to survive when the world told you that you didn't matter. And he was about to teach her that underestimating the wrong person could be a career-ending mistake. The apartment was small, a 2-bedroom unit in military housing that had seen better days. The carpet was worn thin in the high-traffic areas, the kitchen appliances were at least 20 years old, and the air conditioning unit in the window rattled like a dying engine whenever it kicked on. But it was home. Jake had made it as warm and safe as he possibly could for Emma. The walls were covered with her artwork, bright splashes of crayon and paint that transformed the beige monotony into something alive. A bookshelf he had built himself held a collection of picture books organized by color, because Emma had insisted that was the only logical way to arrange them. The small living room had a worn couch, a television that only worked if you hit it in exactly the right spot, and a coffee table that Jake had refinished 3 times because Emma liked to do her homework there. When Jake walked through the door that evening, Emma came running from the kitchen, her pigtails flying behind her. Her face lit up with the kind of pure joy that made everything else fade into background noise. "Daddy!" she shrieked, launching herself at him with the absolute confidence that he would catch her. And he did, always did, scooping her up and spinning her around until she dissolved into giggles. Mrs. Chun emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was a tiny woman in her 70s, a retired school teacher who had taken it upon herself to look after Emma with the fierce devotion of a grandmother. She had known Rachel, had held Jake's hand at the funeral, and had quietly become the anchor that kept their small family from drifting apart. "How did it go?" she asked softly, her dark eyes searching his face. Jake set Emma down and forced a smile. "We'll talk about it later," he said, his voice light. "Right now I want to hear about this young lady's day. Did you finish your book report?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the kitchen table where her backpack sat open, papers spilling out in organized chaos. "I wrote about the princess who saved herself," she announced proudly. "Mrs. Rodriguez said it was very empowering." Jake laughed, a real, genuine sound that pushed back the darkness that had been threatening to settle over him since he left General Hartman's office. "That's my girl," he said. "Princesses who save themselves are the best kind." Merce. Chun gathered her things, patting Jake on the shoulder as she headed for the door. "There's chicken and rice in the oven," she said. "And Jake, whatever happened today, you'll figure it out. You always do." After she left, the apartment settled into the comfortable rhythm of their evening routine. Emma chattered away about her day while Jake reheated dinner, telling him about the boy in her class who ate glue, about the playground argument over who got to be the queen during recess, about the butterfly she had seen on the way home. Jake listened to every word, asking questions and offering commentary, giving her the full attention she deserved. This was the part of his day that mattered. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the rejection. Just this. just being Emma's dad. After dinner, they curled up on the couch together for their nightly ritual. Jake read to her from a worn copy of a fantasy novel about a girl who discovered she could talk to dragons. Emma was tucked under his arm, her small body warm and solid against his side, her breathing slow and steady. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and the faint tong of the playground, little girl's sweat and sunshine. He read until her eyes started to droop, until her questions became softer and less frequent, until finally she was asleep, her hand clutching the edge of his shirt. He carried her to her bedroom, a small space that he had painted pale purple because it was her favorite color. Her bed was covered with stuffed animals, an army of soft defenders that kept the nightmares at bay. He tucked her in carefully, kissing her forehead and whispering the words Rachel used to say, "Sweet dreams. Little love. I'll see you in the morning sunshine." Only after Emma was asleep, only after the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic, did Jake allow himself to feel the weight of the day. He sat down at the small desk in the corner of his bedroom, the one where he did his studying, pulled out the file he had prepared for his OCS application. It was thick, meticulously organized, and now utterly useless. He had spent months putting it together. Letters of recommendation from commanding officers who had watched him turn struggling maintenance crews into efficient, proud teams. Documentation of the advanced technical certifications he had earned. Transcripts from the online courses he had taken in leadership, military history, and aerospace engineering. Records of his volunteer work with the base youth program. And buried at the very bottom, carefully protected in a plastic sleeve, a single newspaper clipping that he never showed anyone. The headline read, "Local Airman Saves 3 in Highway Crash." The article was from 6 years ago, long before Rachel got sick. Back when life still felt full of possibility. Jake had been driving home from the base when he witnessed a multi-car pileup on the interstate. He had pulled over without thinking, running toward the wreckage while other drivers stood frozen in shock. He had pulled an elderly man from a burning car seconds before it exploded. He had stabilized a woman with a compound fracture using his belt as a tourniquet. He had talked a terrified teenager through her panic attack while they waited for the ambulance. The local paper had called him a hero. His commanding officer had put him in for a commendation. And Rachel had cried when she read the article, not because she was scared of what could have happened, but because she was so proud of who he was. "You have the heart of a leader," she had told him that night, her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat. "Don't let anyone tell you different." But General Hartman had told him different. She had looked at his entire career, at everything he had accomplished, and seen only a grunt, someone beneath consideration, someone who would never be more than what he was. Jake felt the anger return, hot and bitter. It wasn't the rejection itself that stung so badly. He had been rejected before. He'd been passed over for promotions, overlooked for special assignments, dismissed by officers who saw enlisted personnel as interchangeable parts in a machine. He had learned to live with that, but this was different. This time Emma was counting on him. This time he had promised her that they were going to build a better life, that Daddy was going to become an officer so they could afford a real house with a backyard where she could have a dog. This time he had let himself hope, and hope was a dangerous thing when the world was determined to crush it. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Marcus Webb, his best friend and the only person on base who really understood what Jake was going through. Marcus was also a maintenance sergeant, also passed over and underestimated, and also quietly studying for his own shot at OCS. The text was short and direct. "Heard what happened. Hartman's office tomorrow morning. 800 hours. There's something you need to see." Jake frowned, typing back a quick reply. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's response came immediately. "Just trust me. 800 hours. Wear your dress blues." Jake stared at the phone, confused and wary. Marcus wasn't the type to play games, and he definitely wasn't the type to waste time with dramatic gestures. If he said there was something Jake needed to see, then there was something worth seeing. Jake sent back a simple thumbs-up emoji and set the phone aside. He turned off the desk lamp and sat in the darkness for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust. From down the hall, he could hear the soft sound of Emma's breathing, steady and peaceful. She trusted him completely, absolutely, without question. She believed that her daddy could do anything, fix anything, make anything right, and he couldn't let her down. General Victoria Hartman thought she'd closed the door on Jake Reeves, but she had no idea that she had just opened a different door entirely. She had no idea that 18 years of being underestimated had taught Jake to be patient, to be strategic, to wait for exactly the right moment to prove everyone wrong. She had no idea that the grunt she had dismissed so casually had skills and experience that went far beyond turning wrenches. And she had absolutely no idea that Marcus Webb had just stumbled onto information that was going to change everything. Jake stood up and walked quietly down the hall to Emma's room. He pushed the door open just a crack, watching her sleep in the soft glow of her nightlight. She had kicked off her blanket and was sprawled across the bed like a starfish, one arm hanging off the edge, completely vulnerable and completely safe because she knew her daddy was there. He pulled the blanket back over her gently, tucking it around her small shoulders. Tomorrow morning at 800 hours, he would walk back into General Hartman's world, but this time he wouldn't be walking in as a supplicant. This time, he would be walking in with something she never expected, the truth. And the truth, Jake knew from long experience, had a way of making even the most arrogant officers freeze mid-sentence. Jake arrived at the base at 7:30, giving himself plenty of time to mentally prepare for whatever Marcus had planned. His dress blues were immaculate, each ribbon placed with precision, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that would have made his old drill instructor weep with pride. He had left Emma with Mrs. Chun, who had looked at him with knowing eyes and squeezed his hand before he left. "Go show them who you are," she had whispered. Rachel would be so proud. The morning air was already thick with humidity, the Texas sun climbing steadily into a sky that promised another scorching day. Jake walked across the parking lot toward the administrative building, his mind running through possibilities. What could Marcus have found? What was important enough to require dress blues and the risk of another confrontation with General Hartman? Marcus was waiting for him in the lobby, also in full dress uniform, his dark face serious and focused. He was a tall man, built like a linebacker, with kind eyes that contrasted sharply with his imposing physical presence. He and Jake had gone through technical school together nearly 2 decades ago, and they had remained close through deployments, transfers, personal tragedies, and the grinding routine of military life. Marcus had been at Rachel's funeral, had helped Jake pack up their old house, had been there for every milestone and every crisis. If anyone understood what this OCS rejection meant to Jake, it was Marcus. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Jake frowned. "Ready for what?" Marcus glanced around the lobby, making sure they were alone, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Last night I was doing inventory in the archive. You know, the old filing room where they keep physical records from before everything went digital. I was looking for maintenance logs from '97 and I found something else entirely." He handed Jake the paper. It was a photocopy of an official Air Force document, yellowed with age but still clearly legible. Jake's eyes scanned the page and his breath caught in his throat. It was a commendation dated from 1991. The name at the top read, Captain Victoria Hartman. The citation described how Captain Hartman had been grounded for 6 months following a training incident in which she had violated flight protocols, nearly causing a mid-air collision with another aircraft. The document detailed a pattern of reckless behavior, insubordination, poor judgment. But what made Jake's blood run cold was the final paragraph. It stated that Captain Hartman had been given a second chance, a path to redemption, specifically because the reviewing board believed that good officers could come from anywhere, even from those who made serious mistakes. The board had noted that her enlisted service as a ground crew mechanic before attending OCS had given her valuable perspective, and that her determination to overcome her past demonstrated the kind of resilience the Air Force needed. Jake read the document 3 times, each word sinking deeper into his consciousness. Victoria Hartman, the general who had dismissed him as just a grunt, had herself been an enlisted mechanic. She had worked on the flight line, turned wrenches, done exactly the kind of work that Jake had been doing for 18 years. And not only that, she had nearly been drummed out of the service entirely for recklessness, for the kind of judgment failures that should have ended her career. But someone had given her a second chance. Someone had looked past her mistakes and seen her potential, and she had become a general. She had climbed to the highest levels of command, and now she was denying that same opportunity to others. "Where did you find this?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression was grim. "It was in her personnel file, the old paper one. It should have been digitized and sealed, but I guess someone missed it during the transition. I made a copy before I realized what I was looking at. Question is, what do you want to do with it?" Jake stared at the document, his mind racing. This was leverage. This was ammunition. He could walk into Hartman's office right now and lay this paper on her desk. He could watch her face go pale as she realized that her past had come back to haunt her. He could force her to approve his OCS application or risk having her own history exposed. It would be justice. It would be revenge. It would also be blackmail. Jake carefully refolded the paper and handed it back to Marcus. "No," he said quietly, "we're not doing this." Marcus blinked in surprise. "What?" "Jake, this is your shot. This is how you get what you deserve." Jake shook his head, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him like a mantle. "If I use this, I'm no better than she is. I'm using fear and manipulation instead of merit. And what kind of officer would that make me? What kind of example would I be setting for Emma?" He met Marcus's eyes. "I want to be an officer because I've earned it, not because I forced someone's hand with dirt from their past. Besides, this isn't about revenge. This is about doing what's right." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "You know what, man? That's exactly why you should be an officer. That right there. That's leadership." He tucked the paper back into his jacket. "So what's the plan then?" Jake took a deep breath, the pieces falling into place in his mind. "We're going to go to her office, and we're going to tell her the truth. All of it. We're going to remind her where she came from, and we're going to ask her to remember what it felt like to be given a second chance. And if she still says no, then at least we'll know we took the high road." They walked together through the maze of hallways toward the administrative wing. With each step, Jake felt his resolve strengthening. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't bitter. He was simply determined to be heard, to be seen as a human being rather than a category on a form. When they reached General Hartman's outer office, her aide, a young lieutenant named Morrison, looked up from his desk with an expression of surprise. "Sergeant Reeves," he said, his tone cautious, "I don't believe the general's expecting you." "She's not," Jake replied calmly. But I need to speak with her, it's important. Morrison hesitated, glancing at the closed door behind him. She's preparing for a briefing. This really isn't a good time. Then we'll wait, Marcus said, his voice firm but polite. We'll wait as long as it takes. They stood there in the outer office, two sergeants in dress blues, silent and patient. Morrison made a few attempts to convince them to leave, to schedule an appointment, to come back another day. But Jake and Marcus simply stood their ground, their presence a quiet but undeniable statement. Other personnel walked past, casting curious glances at the unusual sight. Word began to spread through the building that something was happening, that Master Sergeant Reeves was staging some kind of protest outside the general's office. The minutes stretched into an hour. Morrison grew increasingly nervous, making hushed phone calls and typing urgent emails. Finally, the door to the inner office opened and General Hartman emerged, her expression thunderous. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. "This is highly inappropriate. You were dismissed yesterday, Sergeant Reeves. You have no business being here." Jake met her gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "With respect, ma'am, I have something important to say. Something you need to hear." Hartman's eyes narrowed. "I don't have time for this. I have a briefing in 20 minutes. Then I'll be brief," Jake said. He took a step forward, his voice calm and measured. "Yesterday you told me that I was just a grunt, that I didn't have what it takes to be an officer, that my service as an enlisted member somehow disqualified me from leadership." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I've spent 18 years learning what leadership really means. Not from a textbook or a classroom, but from the men and women I work with every day. I've learned that leadership is about seeing people for who they are, not what they are. It's about lifting others up, not pushing them down. And it's about remembering where you came from." General Hartman's expression flickered, just for a moment, a crack in her armor. Jake pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "You see, ma'am, I know your story. Not the official version, not the one in the press releases and the award citations. I know the real story. I know that you were once where I am now. An enlisted mechanic working on the flight line, dreaming of something more. I know that you made mistakes, serious ones, and that someone gave you a second chance. Someone looked past your past and saw your potential, and that decision changed your life." Hartman's face had gone pale, her jaw tightening. "You have no right," she began, her voice low and dangerous. But Jake cut her off. Not with anger, but with a quiet intensity that demanded to be heard. "I have every right, ma'am, because you're doing to me exactly what could have been done to you. You're judging me not by my merit, not by my accomplishments, but by assumptions and prejudices. You're denying me the same opportunity that saved your career. And the worst part is, you know better. You know what it's like to be underestimated. You know what it's like to be told you're not good enough. So why are you doing it to someone else?" The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison sat frozen at his desk, his eyes wide. Marcus stood like a statue beside Jake, solid and unmoving. And General Victoria Hartman, the woman who commanded with absolute authority, who had flown combat missions and made life or death decisions without hesitation, stood utterly still, her face a mask that was slowly crumbling. For the first time since Jake had entered her office yesterday, she looked at him, really looked at him, not as a file, not as a category, not as an inconvenience, as a person. The office was so quiet that Jake could hear the wall clock ticking, each second marking the space between what had been said and what would come next. General Hartman's hand had moved to her desk, gripping the edge as if she needed something solid to anchor herself. Her face had lost its hard edges, replaced by something raw and unguarded. Jake watched as 30 years of carefully constructed authority seemed to waver, like heat shimmer on asphalt. She opened her mouth twice before any words came out, and when they did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" she asked, and there was no anger in the question, only a weary kind of resignation. Jake felt Marcus shift beside him, but he kept his eyes locked on the general. "It doesn't matter how I found out, ma'am. What matters is that it's true, and what matters even more is what you do now." Hartman's eyes swept past him to Morrison, who was still frozen at his desk, clearly having heard every word. "Leave us," she said quietly. Morrison practically leaped from his chair and hurried out of the office, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The three of them stood in the sudden privacy, the weight of the moment settling over them like snow. Hartman walked slowly back to her desk, but didn't sit down. Instead, she moved to the window, her back to them, staring out at the flight line where jets sat gleaming in the morning sun. When she spoke, her voice was different. The sharp military precision was gone, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. "I was 23 years old," she began, her words measured and careful. "I had been enlisted for 4 years, working as a crew chief on F-16s. I was good at my job, damn good, but I wanted more. I wanted to fly. The problem was, I was angry at a system that I thought didn't see me, didn't value me. So when I finally got my shot at OCS, when I finally got into pilot training, I flew like I had something to prove, and I almost killed 2 people because of it." She turned back to face them, and Jake saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Shame. "The board that reviewed my case could have ended my career right there. I gave them every reason to, but there was one colonel, Colonel James Brennan, who stood up for me. He was the one who had been enlisted before he became an officer. He was the one who saw past my anger and my mistakes. He told the board that the Air Force needed officers who understood what it meant to struggle, who knew what it was like to be at the bottom looking up. He said that my enlisted service wasn't a liability. It was my greatest asset, and he put his own reputation on the line to give me a second chance. The silence stretched out again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not hostile, but contemplative. Hartman walked to a photograph on the wall, one that Jake had noticed yesterday but hadn't paid much attention to. It showed a younger version of Hartman in a flight suit, standing next to an older officer with silver hair and kind eyes. She touched the frame gently. Colonel Brennan died 5 years of cancer. I spoke at his funeral. I told everyone there that he had saved my life, not just my career. And I meant it. She looked back at Jake, her expression complex and conflicted. So yes, Sergeant Reeves, I know exactly what it's like to be where you are, and I have absolutely no excuse for how I treated you yesterday. Jake felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, but he didn't move. He needed to hear all of it, needed to understand. Then why did you? He asked. Why did you reject my application without even really looking at it? Why did you dismiss me as just a grunt? Hartman returned to her desk and finally sat down, her movements slower, less certain than before. She gestured for Jake and Marcus to sit as well. They did, settling into the leather chairs across from. She folded her hands on the desk, staring at them for a long moment before speaking. Because somewhere along the way I forgot. She looked up, meeting Jake's eyes directly. I forgot what it was like. I forgot the fear and the desperation and the feeling of being invisible. I climbed the ranks, and with each promotion, I got further away from the person I used to be. I started seeing enlisted personnel the way that so many officers had once seen me, as means to an end, as parts of the machine. And when I saw your application yesterday, when I saw another enlisted member asking for the same chance I had been given, I didn't see you. I saw a threat to the system I had become comfortable in. I saw someone who might expose the fact that I had gotten soft, that I had stopped fighting for the people who actually make this Air Force work. It was the most honest thing Jake had heard from a senior officer in his entire career. The vulnerability in her admission was staggering, and he found himself respecting her more in this moment than he had in all their previous interactions. But respect wasn't enough. He still needed to know where they went from here. So what happens now, ma'am? He asked. Do I get my second chance? Hartman was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. Then she reached across her desk and picked up the phone, pressing a button. Morrison, she said when her aide answered. Clear my schedule for the next 2 hours. Cancel the briefing. Tell them it's a personal emergency. She hung up and turned her attention back to Jake and Marcus. I'm going to approve your OCS application, she said, her voice firm and official once more. But I'm not doing it because you confronted me or because you know about my past. I'm doing it because I just spent the last 10 minutes actually reading your file. Really reading it, not just skimming for reasons to say no. And what I found was a record of excellence that I should have seen yesterday. You have leadership experience, technical expertise, commendations for valor, and letters of recommendation from officers I trust and respect. You're exactly the kind of person this Air Force needs in its officer ranks. The fact that I almost rejected you because of my own blind spots and failures is something I'm going to have to live with. Jake felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked the breath out of it. He had prepared himself for another fight, for another rejection, and the sudden shift left him momentarily speechless. Beside him, Marcus let out a long, slow breath, a sound of pure satisfaction, but Hartman wasn't finished. She stood up, came around the desk, and extended her hand to Jake. He stood automatically and took it, feeling the firm grip of her handshake. I owe you an apology, Sergeant Reeves. A real one. What I said yesterday was wrong. It was cruel. And it was beneath the standards I claim to uphold. You are not just a grunt. You're a skilled, dedicated airman who has given 18 years of your life to this service. And if I had done my job properly, I would have seen that. Thank you, ma'am, Jake managed, his voice thick with emotion. Hartman released his hand and turned to Marcus. And Sergeant Webb? I assume you're the one who did the research that brought you both here this morning. Marcus straightened slightly. Yes, ma'am. Hartman nodded slowly. That took courage. Speaking truth, the power always does. I want to see your OCS application on my desk by the end of the week. Marcus's eyes widened pride. Ma'am, I haven't submitted one yet. Then it's time you did, Hartman said firmly. If you're willing to stand beside your friend in what could have been a career-ending confrontation, then you have the kind of loyalty and integrity this officer corps needs. Consider that in order. The three of them stood there for a moment, the power dynamic in the room completely transformed. Hartman was still a general, still their commanding officer, but she was also now something else. An ally. Someone who had remembered who she used to be and was determined to do better. Before you go, she said, moving back behind her desk and opening a drawer. She pulled out a small black box and held it in her hands for a moment before speaking. Colonel Brennan gave me something when I graduated from OCS. He said it was a reminder of where I came from and where I was going. She opened the box, revealing a simple metal pin in the shape of an eagle, tarnished with age. It's not an official insignificant, just something he had made. He told me that eagles fly high, but they build their nests on the ground. He said never to forget that the higher I flew, the more important it was to remember my roots. She held the pin out to Jake. I want you to have this, not as payment or an apology, but as a promise. Promise that when you become an officer, when you're the one sitting behind this desk someday, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember what it felt like to be dismissed and overlooked, and you'll do better than I did. You'll be the kind of leader who sees people, who lifts them up, who gives them the chances they deserve. Jake took the pin carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. It was small and simple, but it represented something enormous. A legacy, a responsibility, a promise to pay forward the second chance he was being given. "I will, ma'am," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise you I will." As Jake and Marcus walked out of the building 30 minutes later, both carrying copies of approved OCS applications, the Texas sun seemed brighter than it had been when they arrived. Jake pulled out his phone and sent a text to Mrs. Chun. "Good news. Tell Emma her daddy did it." The response came back almost immediately. "She never doubted you for a second." "Neither did I." Jake smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the small metal eagle pin, and he felt a surge of purpose so strong it was almost overwhelming. He was going to be an officer. He was going to build a better life for Emma. And someday, when he was the one with the authority and the power, he was going to remember this day. He was going to be the kind of leader who saw potential in everyone, who gave second chances, who understood that true strength came from remembering where you started. The Iron Eagle had taken flight. Officer Candidate School was designed to break people down and rebuild them into leaders. The 12 weeks of intensive training pushed candidates to their physical, mental, and emotional limits, testing not just their knowledge and skills, but their character and resilience. For Jake, it meant leaving Emma with Mrs. Chun for weeks at a time, missing bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes, communicating through brief phone calls that never felt long enough. It meant standing in formation at 5 in the morning, being screamed at by instructors who were looking for any sign of weakness, running obstacle courses until his muscles screamed, studying regulations and leadership principles until the words blurred on the page. But Jake had something most of the other candidates didn't have. He had 18 years of perspective, a daughter counting on him, and a promise to keep. The first week was the hardest, not because of the physical demands, though those were brutal, but because of the other candidates. Most of them were fresh out of college, early 20s, with the kind of confidence that came from never having truly failed at anything. They looked at Jake, who at 38 was nearly 2 decades older than most of them, with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. During the first leadership exercise, a navigation challenge through rough terrain, one of them, a cocky kid named Bradley Thornton from some prestigious military academy, had made a comment that cut deep. "Isn't this a little old for you, Sergeant? Maybe you should have stayed where you belong." Jake had simply smiled and kept moving, but the words had stung more than he wanted to admit. Marcus had joined him 2 weeks later in the next OCS class, and having his friend there made the experience more bearable. They pushed each other during the physical training, studied together late into the night, and reminded each other why they were doing this when the exhaustion and doubt threatened to overwhelm them. On the weekends, when they were allowed brief phone calls home, Jake would listen to Emma's voice and feel his resolve strengthen. She would tell him about school, about the picture she drew of him in his new officer uniform, about how she was counting down the days until graduation when she could pin his new rank on his shoulders. Those calls were lifelines, reminding him that all the pain and struggle had a purpose. The turning point came during week 7, in a leadership simulation that was designed to test decision-making under pressure. The scenario was brutal. A simulated forward operating base under attack, limited resources, conflicting intelligence reports, and civilian casualties mounting by the minute. The candidates were divided into teams, each taking turns in the command position while the others played supporting roles. When it was Jake's turn, he found himself facing a nightmare scenario. The instructors had programmed in a situation where there were no good options, only terrible ones and slightly less terrible. A group of civilians was trapped in a building that was taking fire. He could send in a rescue team, but the risk was catastrophically high. He could call in an airstrike to suppress the enemy position, but it would likely cause civilian casualties. Or he could hold position and wait for reinforcements, but every minute of delay meant more deaths. Jake stood in the command center, surrounded by screens showing the chaos of the simulation, his team looking at him expectantly. Bradley Thornton was playing his executive officer, and Jake could see the smirk on his face, the expectation that the old enlisted guy would crack under the pressure. For a moment, Jake felt the weight of impossible choice crushing down on him. Then he remembered something from his maintenance days, something that Colonel Brennan, whose eagle pin Jake carried in his pocket every day, had written in one of his leadership manuals. The best leaders don't make perfect decisions. They make human decisions and take responsibility for the consequences. Jake took a breath and made his call. He ordered a small team to create a diversion on the east side of the enemy position, pulling their fire away from the trapped civilians. Simultaneously, he sent his rescue team in from the west, giving them a narrow window to extract the civilians before the enemy could reposition. It was risky, it required perfect timing, and it could go horribly wrong. The simulation played out in agonizing slow motion. The diversion team took heavy fire, several members going down. The rescue team breached the building and found the civilians, but the extraction was chaotic. In the end, Jake managed to save 80% of the trapped civilians and got most of his rescue team out alive. But 3 simulated soldiers died in the diversion, and the enemy position remained active. When the simulation ended and the lights came up, Jake stood in the sudden quiet, his hands shaking slightly, feeling the weight of even those simulated deaths. The senior instructor, a hard-eyed lieutenant colonel named Vasquez, walked to the front of the room. The other candidates were silent, waiting for the assessment that would make or break Jake's standing in the class. "Candidate Reeves," Vasquez said, his voice neutral. Walk me through your decision process. Jake straightened, forcing his voice to remain steady. Sir, I evaluated 3 options and determined that all of them would result in casualties. I chose the option that gave the civilians the highest probability of survival while still maintaining some offensive capability against the enemy. I accept full responsibility for the personnel losses incurred during the diversion action. And if this had been real, if those were real soldiers who died following your orders, Jake met his eyes directly, then I would have to live with that, sir. I would visit their families, I would explain my reasoning, and I would carry that weight for the rest of my career. But I would make the same call again because saving civilians is part of our mission, and leadership means making hard choices even when there are no good options. The room was utterly silent. Then Vasquez did something Jake hadn't seen him do in 7 weeks. He smiled. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what command looks like. Not perfect decisions, but principled ones. Not avoiding responsibility, but embracing it. Candidate Reeves just demonstrated more leadership in 10 minutes than some of you have shown in 7 weeks. He turned back to Jake. Well done, candidate. That's the kind of officer this Air Force needs. As Jake returned to his seat, he felt something shift in the room. The other candidates looked at him differently now. Not with condescension, but with respect. Even Bradley Thornton had lost his smirk, replaced by a thoughtful expression that suggested he had just learned something important. After the exercise, as the candidates filed out for evening chow, Thornton caught up with Jake in the hallway. Reeves, he said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. That was impressive in there. I don't think I would have had the guts to make that call. Jake shrugged, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. You would have figured it out. We all do eventually. Thornton hesitated, then extended his hand. I owe you an apology for what I said that first week, about you being too old, about staying where you belong. That was out of line. Jake took his hand, feeling the firm grip. We're good, Thornton. We're all learning here. That's the point. As they walked together toward the dining facility, Jake realized that this was leadership too. Not just making hard calls under pressure, but building bridges, turning adversaries into allies, creating a team from a group of individuals. The remaining weeks of OCS flew by in a blur of classes, exercises, and evaluations. Jake excelled in leadership theory, drawing on nearly 2 decades of practical experience. He struggled with some of the academic material, particularly the advanced tactical planning courses, but he compensated by studying longer and harder than everyone else. Marcus became a steady presence, the two of them forming an unofficial leadership corps that other candidates gravitated toward. They organized study groups, helped struggling candidates with physical training, and quietly set a standard of professionalism and mutual support that transformed their class into something cohesive and powerful. On a Friday evening, 3 weeks before graduation, Jake was called to the commandant's office. His heart hammered as he walked across the quad, wondering what he had done wrong, what regulation he had violated. But when he entered the office, he found not the commandant, but General Hartman. She was in her service dress, standing by the window, and she turned when he entered. At ease, Reeves, she said, her tone warm. This isn't official. I just wanted to check on your progress. Jake relaxed slightly. I'm doing well, ma'am. It's challenging, but I'm holding my own. More than holding your own, from what I hear, she replied. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez speaks very highly of you. You're one of the strongest candidates he's seen in years. Jake felt a flush of pride, but kept his expression neutral. I'm just trying to honor the opportunity you gave me, ma'am. Hartman walked closer, her expression serious. I need you to understand something, Jake. What I did, approving your application, that wasn't charity, that wasn't guilt. I approved you because you earned it. Everything that happens from here on out, that's all you. Your success or failure, it's yours. I know you came from enlisted ranks. I know people will judge you for it, will expect you to fail. But you have something most officers never develop. You understand the people you'll be leading. You've been where they are. Use that. Make it your strength. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. I will, ma'am. I promise. As he left her office and walked back toward his barracks, the evening sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake felt the pieces of his life finally clicking into place. In 3 weeks, he would graduate, he would become an officer, and he would prove that second chances, when given to the right people for the right reasons, could change not just individual lives, but the entire system. Graduation day arrived with the kind of crystalline morning that felt almost too perfect to be real. The sky was a brilliant, unblemished blue, and a light breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the parade ground. Rows of white chairs had been set up facing a raised platform where the commandant and senior officers sat in their dress uniforms, their ribbons and medals catching the sunlight. Behind the seating area, families gathered, a sea of proud faces holding cameras and flowers, waiting to celebrate with their newly commissioned officers. Jake stood in formation with his class, his uniform crisp and perfect, feeling the weight of the moment settling over him like a blessing. Emma was in the third row, sitting between Mrs. Chun and Marcus's wife, Patricia. She wore a new pink dress that Mrs. Chun had bought specially for the occasion. Her hair was pulled back with the same butterfly clip she had given Jake for luck on that terrible day in General Hartman's office. She kept waving at him, her excitement too big to be contained by ceremony and protocol. Every time Jake caught her eye, she would give him an exaggerated thumbs up, her whole face glowing with pride. He had to fight to keep his military bearing, to not break into a grin that would have been entirely inappropriate for the solemnity of the occasion. This was the moment he had been working toward for months, the moment that would change both their lives forever. The ceremony proceeded with military precision. The commandant spoke about duty and honor and sacrifice, about the weight of responsibility that came with the rank they were about to receive. General Hartman was the keynote speaker, and Jake listened to her words with a new understanding. She spoke about leadership not as a position, but as a calling, about the obligation to serve those who served under you, about the importance of remembering where you came from no matter how high you climb. Her eyes found Jake in the formation several times, and he understood that this speech was not just for the graduating class. It was her own recommitment to the values she had nearly forgotten. When it came time for the actual commissioning, the candidates were called forward one by one to receive their rank and take their oath. The tradition was that a family member or chosen mentor would pin the new second lieutenant bars onto the officer's uniform, a symbolic passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. Most of the candidates had parents or siblings waiting. Bradley Thornton's father, a retired colonel, stood waiting with barely concealed pride. Marcus's wife, Patricia, held the rank insignia with trembling hands, tears already streaming down her face. And Jake had Emma, who had been clutching the small velvet box containing his new rank since they arrived at the ceremony. When Jake's name was called, he marched forward with measured steps, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. He stopped in front of the commandant, saluted, and raised his right hand to take the oath that would transform him from enlisted airman to commissioned officer. I, Jake Reeves, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The words felt sacred, heavy with meaning, a promise that went beyond career advancement or personal ambition. This was about service, about giving yourself to something larger than your own life. When he finished the oath, the commandant smiled and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Reeves." The word lieutenant sent a shiver through Jake's entire body. He was no longer a sergeant. He was an officer. Emma was already rushing forward before anyone could call her up, her dress swirling around her legs, her face split by a smile so wide it looked like it might break her face in half. Mrs. Chun had to hustle to keep up, carrying the velvet box and trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Jake knelt down so Emma could reach his shoulders, and she carefully opened the box, her small fingers shaking with concentration. The gold bars gleamed in the sunlight, simple and beautiful and weighted with meaning. Emma lifted one bar out and positioned it on Jake's right shoulder, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she carefully pinned it in place. She did the same with the left shoulder, taking her time to make sure it was perfect. When both bars were secured, she stepped back and looked at her daddy, her officer daddy, and her eyes filled with tears. "You did it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Daddy." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, not caring that his uniform was getting wrinkled or that tears were running down his own face. This moment right here was worth every obstacle, every rejection, every moment of doubt and struggle. He had done this for her, to show her that dreams were possible, that hard work mattered, that you could rise above whatever circumstances tried to hold you down. He felt Mrs. Chun's hand on his shoulder, felt her grandmother's pride radiating through her touch. When he finally stood up, still holding Emma's hand, he looked out at the assembled crowd and saw General Hartman standing off to the side. She wasn't applauding like everyone else. She was simply watching him, and when their eyes met, she gave him a single, solemn nod. A promise kept, a circle completed. The reception after the ceremony was a joyous chaos of congratulations and photographs and excited conversations about first assignments. Jake learned that he would be stationed at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, assigned to a logistics squadron where he would be overseeing maintenance operations. It was a perfect fit, utilizing his technical expertise while giving him the opportunity to develop his leadership skills. Marcus was being sent to Langley in Virginia, and while they would no longer be at the same base, they promised to stay in touch, to continue supporting each other as they navigated this new chapter of their careers. Bradley Thornton sought Jake out during the reception, shaking his hand with genuine warmth and telling him that if he ever needed anything, to reach out. The cocky kid from that first week had transformed into a thoughtful young officer who understood that leadership was about people, not position. As the sun began to set and families started to drift away, Jake found himself standing alone on the parade ground, looking at the empty chairs and the platform where he had been commissioned just hours earlier. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small iron eagle pin that General Hartman had given him, holding it in his palm and feeling its weight. He thought about Colonel Brennan, the man who had given Hartman her second chance, who had believed that the best officers came from understanding struggle. He thought about all the enlisted personnel he had worked with over 18 years, good people who deserved officers who truly understood their lives and challenges, and he made himself a promise. He would never forget where he came from. He would never treat enlisted personnel as invisible or less than. He would be the kind of officer who saw people, who lifted them up, who gave them chances to prove themselves. He would honor the second chance he had been given by paying it forward. Emma came running back across the grass, Mrs. Chun trailing behind her with patient affection. "Daddy," Can we go home now? I want to show everyone at school your new bars. Jake scooped her up, settling her on his hip despite the fact that she was getting almost too big to carry. Yeah, baby. Let's go home. As they walked toward the parking lot, Emma chattered excitedly about how she was going to tell everyone that her daddy was a hero, that he was an officer now, that he could do anything. Jake listened to her innocent faith and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a mantle. He was an officer now. He had authority and power that he had never possessed before, and he was determined to use it wisely, to use it well, to make sure that every person under his command felt valued and seen and given the opportunity to reach their full potential. The drive back to base housing took them past the flight line, where jets sat gleaming in the dying light. Jake glanced at them and felt a surge of pride. This was his Air Force now, not just as someone who maintained the machines, but as someone who led the people who made everything work. A climb from the ground to the sky, and he would never forget the view from either place. In the rearview mirror, he caught sight of the iron eagle pin that he had clipped to his sun visor, a constant reminder of the promise he had made and the legacy he was now part of. The iron eagle had landed, and it was time to build a nest. Peterson Air Force Base sprawled across the eastern edge of Colorado Springs, with the Rocky Mountains rising majestically to the west like ancient sentinels. The base was home to several major commands, a bustling hub of Air Force activity where thousands of personnel worked around the clock to support global operations. Jake arrived on a Monday morning in early October, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter, the aspens on the distant mountainsides already turning gold. He drove through the main gate in his 10-year-old truck, Emma bouncing excitedly in the passenger seat, both of them staring wide-eyed at their new home. The base housing office had assigned them a 3-bedroom townhouse, a significant upgrade from their cramped apartment back in Texas. Emma had already claimed the room with the window facing the mountains, declaring it perfect for watching for eagles. Jake's first day as an officer was a study in contrasts. He reported to the 21st Logistics Readiness Squadron, a massive operation responsible for maintaining and supplying everything from aircraft parts to office supplies. His new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for running a tight ship. She welcomed Jake into her office with professional warmth, briefing him on his new responsibilities. He would be overseeing the vehicle maintenance section, a team of 35 enlisted airmen who kept everything from pickup trucks to massive cargo haulers running smoothly. It was exactly the kind of assignment that played to his strengths, but it came with a challenge he hadn't fully anticipated. Half of his new team were people who had worked alongside him or people like him just weeks ago. Now he was their officer, their boss, and the dynamic was complicated. His first meeting with his section was held in a large maintenance bay that smelled of oil and metal and hard work, scents so familiar they felt like home. The airmen stood in loose formation, their uniforms stained with the honest dirt of their profession, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to outright hostile. Jake recognized the looks. These were people who had heard that their new lieutenant was prior enlisted, and they weren't sure what that meant. Some saw it as a good thing, someone who would understand their world. Others saw it as a threat, someone who would be harder on them because he knew all the shortcuts and excuses. And a few, Jake could tell, saw it as an insult. Why should this former grunt get to wear officer's rank when they were still turning wrenches? Jake stood in front of them, very aware of the weight of his new rank on his shoulders. He had spent the previous night rehearsing this moment, planning what he would say, how he would introduce himself. But standing here now, looking at faces that reflected his own past, all the rehearsed words felt hollow and performative. So he decided to just tell them the truth. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying across the bay. "My name is Lieutenant Jake Reeves. 3 months ago, I was exactly where you are right now. I was a master sergeant in maintenance, working nights, turning wrenches, dealing with the same challenges you deal with every day. Some of you are wondering if that makes me a better officer or a worse one. The honest answer is I don't know yet, but I can tell you what I do know." He walked slowly along the formation, meeting eyes, making connections. "I know that maintenance is the backbone of this Air Force. I know that you work in heat and cold and rain, that you skip meals to finish a job, that you take pride in sending aircraft back into the air safely. I know that you're often overlooked, that people only notice you when something goes wrong, not when everything goes right. And I know that you deserve leadership that sees you, that values you, that fights for you." He stopped walking and faced them directly. "I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to be your officer. But I'm also here to be the kind of leader I wish I had always had. Someone who listens, someone who supports you, someone who will go to bat for you when the system tries to grind you down. If I fail at that, you have my permission to call me on it." The section chief, a weathered technical sergeant named Rodriguez, who looked like he had been born holding a wrench, stepped forward. "Permission to speak, sir." Jake nodded. "Granted, Sergeant." Rodriguez studied him for a long moment. "With respect, sir, we've heard this speech before. Every new officer comes in promising to be different, to understand us, to make things better. Then the paperwork piles up, the pressure comes down from above, and suddenly we're just numbers on a readiness report. What makes you different?" It was a fair question, and Jake respected the man for asking it directly. "You're right, Sergeant. Talk is cheap, so I'm not going to make promises I might not keep. Instead, I'm going to ask you to judge me by my actions. Give me 30 days. Watch what I do, not what I say. If at the end of that month you still think I'm just another officer who doesn't get it, then we'll have this conversation again and I'll listen to what you have to say. Deal?" Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but Jake saw the slight nod, the microscopic softening around the eyes. "Deal, sir." The meeting concluded with Jake going over the schedule and priorities for the week. Nothing dramatic or revolutionary, just the practical business of running a maintenance section. But as the airmen dispersed to their workstations, Jake noticed small things. A few nods of approval, a couple of genuine smiles, and one young airman, a baby-faced kid who couldn't have been more than 19, who approached him hesitantly. "Sir, can I ask you something?" Jake turned, giving the kid his full attention. "Of course. What's your name?" "Airman First Class Danny Ortiz, sir." Kid shuffled his feet nervously. "Is it true you have a daughter?" Jake felt his expression soften. "I do. Her name's Emma. She's 6. Ortiz nodded, a flood of relief washing over his young face. "I have a daughter too. She's 3, and I'm trying to figure out how to do this job and be a good dad and not mess everything up." Nobody talks about that stuff. They just expect you to figure it out on your own. Jake understood immediately. This was why representation mattered. This was why having officers who had lived the enlisted experience was so important. Because this young airman saw someone who had walked the same path, who had faced the same struggles, and it gave him permission to be human. "Look, Ortiz," Jake said, his voice low and genuine, "I won't lie to you. It's hard. There are days when you feel like you're failing at everything, but here's what I've learned. Your daughter doesn't need you to be perfect. She needs you to be present. She needs to know you're trying, that she matters. So when you're home, be all the way home. Put the phone down. Listen to her stories. Play the games she wants to play. And when you're here, work as efficiently as you can so you don't have to stay late. If you ever need to leave early for something important for your daughter, you come talk to me first. We'll figure it out." Ortiz's eyes were shining with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." As the young airman walked away, Jake felt a deep sense of purpose settle over him. This was why he had fought so hard to become an officer. Not for the rank or the pay or the prestige, but for moments like this, for the ability to make a real difference in people's lives. The first real test of Jake's leadership came 2 weeks into his assignment. One of his team's critical vehicles, a specialized fuel truck, broke down spectacularly during a major readiness exercise. The truck was essential for refueling aircraft on the flight line, and without it, the entire exercise schedule was in jeopardy. The previous maintenance officer, according to squadron gossip, would have simply screamed at whoever was responsible and demanded impossible miracles. Jake took a different approach. He went directly to the maintenance bay where his team was frantically trying to diagnose the problem. Rodriguez was under the hood, his hands covered in grease, his face tight with stress. "Talk to me, Sergeant," Jake said calmly. "What are we looking at?" Rodriguez didn't sugarcoat it. "The transmission is shot, sir. We're talking about a complete rebuild. Parts we don't have in stock. Best case scenario, we're down for 48 hours. Worst case, 72. That's going to kill the exercise timeline." Jake nodded, his mind already working through options. "Okay, first, I need you to stop worrying about the timeline and focus on the fix. That's my problem to manage, not yours. Second, I need a list of every part we need and every possible source for getting them faster than standard supply channels. Third, I need you to pull your 2 best techs and have them work exclusively on this. Everyone else continues normal operations. We don't sacrifice the rest of the mission for this one problem." Rodriguez stared at him for a moment, clearly expecting blame or panic. Instead, he got calm, clear direction. "Yes, sir. I'm on it." Jake then did something that surprised everyone. He took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and climbed under the truck himself. Rodriguez looked at him incredulously. "Sir, you don't have to do that. You're an officer now." Jake gave him a wry smile. "Rodriguez, I spent 18 years learning how to fix these things. That knowledge didn't disappear when I put on this uniform. Now show me what we're dealing with and let's solve this problem together." For the next 6 hours, Lieutenant Jake Reeves worked alongside his enlisted team, his hands as dirty as theirs, his contribution as real as anyone's. He called in favors from his old network of maintenance contacts across 3 different bases, securing parts that would normally take days to arrive. He personally drove to a civilian auto parts supplier off base to source a compatible component that could be modified to work. And he kept his commander informed every step of the way, managing expectations while his team managed the repair. When the fuel truck roared back to life 30 hours after it broke down, beating even the best case estimate, the maintenance bay erupted in cheers. Jake stood back and watched his team celebrate, feeling a bone-deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with mission accomplished. Rodriguez approached him, extending a grease-stained hand. Jake shook it firmly. "You proved something today, sir," Rodriguez said quietly. "You proved you're not just another officer. You're one of us who happens to wear bars. That's a rare thing." Jake felt the acceptance in those words, the trust that he had earned through action rather than speeches. "Thank you, Sergeant, but this was all your team. I just helped remove some obstacles." Rodriguez shook his head. "No, sir. You showed us that leadership isn't about standing on the sidelines and pointing. It's about getting in the fight with your people. That's something we can follow." That evening, Jake came home to find Emma waiting by the window, her face pressed against the glass, watching for his truck. When he walked through the door, still smelling of grease and sweat, she wrinkled her nose dramatically. "Daddy, you smell like the garage." He laughed. scooping her up despite his dirty clothes. "I had to help fix a big truck today, baby. It was important." She studied his face with that uncanny 6-year-old perception. "Did you save the day?" He thought about his team, about Rodriguez's words, about the trust he was slowly building. "I helped," he said honestly, "but mostly I just made sure the real heroes had what they needed to save the day themselves." Emma considered this, then nodded sagely. "That sounds like what officers are supposed to do." Her simple wisdom made him smile. "When did you get so smart?" She giggled. "I've always been smart, Daddy. You've just finally noticed." As he sat with her that evening, helping with homework and listening to her chatter about school, Jake felt the pieces of his life aligning in a way they never had before. He was an officer now, yes, but more importantly, he was the kind of officer who understood that leadership wasn't about authority or position. It was about service. It was about clearing the path for others to succeed. It was about remembering where you came from and using that knowledge to make things better for everyone. The Iron Eagle had built its nest, and it was stronger than he ever imagined. 6 months into his assignment at Peterson, Jake had transformed his section from a struggling unit with low morale into one of the highest performing teams on base. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't come from dramatic gestures or revolutionary policies. It had come from 1,000 small decisions, from consistently choosing to see his people as humans rather than resources, from fighting battles with the bureaucracy that his airmen never knew about, from being present and engaged and genuinely interested in their lives. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Chun, had noticed. She called Jake into her office on a cold February morning, the mountains outside her window capped with fresh snow. "Close the door, Lieutenant," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Jake sat, trying to read her expression and coming up empty. He had learned that Chun was a master at concealing her thoughts until she was ready to reveal them. She studied him for a long moment, her fingers steepled in front of her. "I've been reviewing performance data across all sections in the squadron," she began. "Your vehicle maintenance team has achieved a 97% mission capability rate for the last 3 months. That's the highest in the wing. Your people consistently exceed standards, complaints are down, retention is up. I've had 3 separate airmen from your section tell me that you're the best officer they've ever worked for." She leaned forward slightly. "So I have a question for you. How are you doing it?" Jake was caught off guard by the directness of the question. He had expected praise, maybe some kind of recognition, but not this. "Ma'am, I'm not doing anything special. I'm just trying to take care of my people." Chun shook her head. "No, Lieutenant, that's exactly what makes it special. Most officers say they take care of their people, but you actually do it. I've watched you. You know every airman's name. You know their families. You show up on the flight line at 3 in the morning when there's a critical repair, not to supervise, but to help. You fight for their training, their awards, their leave requests." She paused. "You lead like someone who remembers what it's like to be led badly." Jake felt the weight of her observation. "That's because I do remember, ma'am. I remember what it felt like to be invisible, to be treated like I didn't matter. I swore I would never do that to anyone else." Chun nodded slowly. "I'm putting you in for an early promotion to first lieutenant. You've earned it. But more than that, I'm recommending you for a position on the Wing Commander's Leadership Council. It's a small group of company-grade officers who advise on policy issues affecting junior enlisted personnel. Your perspective would be invaluable." Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with trepidation. He wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of visibility, that kind of responsibility. But he also knew that if he wanted to make real systemic change, he needed to be in rooms where decisions were made. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down." Chun smiled. "I know you won't. Now get out of here. You have a section to run." As Jake left her office, he felt the trajectory of his career shifting again. He had proven himself as a section leader. Now he would have the opportunity to influence policy at a higher level. It was both exciting and terrifying. The Leadership Council met monthly in a conference room in Wing headquarters. Jake attended his first meeting 2 weeks later, feeling distinctly out of place among the other junior officers. Most of them were academy graduates or ROTC standouts, polished and articulate, comfortable in the world of high-level meetings and strategic planning. They spoke in acronyms and buzzwords, discussed theories and metrics, and seemed more interested in impressing the wing commander than in actually solving problems. Jake sat quietly through the first hour, listening and learning the dynamics of the room. The topic of discussion was enlisted retention, specifically why the Air Force was losing skilled technical personnel at alarming rates. Various officers offered suggestions: better marketing of career benefits, more emphasis on education opportunities, stricter enforcement of service commitments. Jake listened to the suggestions, getting progressively more disconnected from reality, and he felt his frustration building. Finally, he raised his hand. The wing commander, Colonel Marcus Stedman, a decorated fighter pilot with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through nonsense, nodded at him. "Lieutenant Reeves, you've been quiet. What are your thoughts?" Jake took a breath. "With respect, sir, I think we're approaching this from the wrong angle. We're treating retention as a marketing problem when it's actually a respect problem." The room went silent. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. Jake pressed on. "I've talked to dozens of airmen who are considering leaving the service. Almost none of them cite pay or benefits as their primary reason. They cite feeling undervalued. They talk about leadership that doesn't listen. They describe a culture where they're expected to sacrifice everything while being treated as interchangeable parts. No amount of clever marketing is going to fix that. Colonel Stedman leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Go on. Jake felt the attention of the entire room focused on him, but he refused to back down. Sir, I was enlisted for 18 years before I commissioned. I worked with hundreds of airmen across multiple bases. The ones who stayed, who re-enlisted even when they had better opportunities outside, they stayed because of leadership. Because they had a supervisor who saw them as people, because they had an officer who fought for them, because they felt like they mattered. He gestured around the table. We can't legislate that or mandate it. We can only model it. If we want better retention, we need better leaders at every level. Leaders who remember that every airman is someone's son or daughter, someone's parent, someone with dreams and challenges and value. The silence that followed felt like it stretched for hours. Then Colonel Stedman did something unexpected. He smiled. That's the most honest thing I've heard in this room in 6 months, Lieutenant. You're absolutely right. The question is, how do we institutionalize that? How do we create a culture where what you're describing becomes the norm rather than the exception? And just like that, Jake found himself in the middle of a real conversation about real change. The other officers, initially defensive, began opening up, sharing their own experiences and observation. The meeting ran over by 40 minutes, and by the end they had outlined a pilot program focused on leadership development that emphasized empathy and human connection. Colonel Stedman assigned Jake to lead the working group that would develop the program details. As they filed out of the conference room, several officers approached Jake to shake his hand, to thank him for his candor. One of them, a first lieutenant named Sarah Kwan, pulled him aside. That took guts, she said admiringly. I've been in these meetings for 6 months and never had the courage to say what everyone was thinking. Jake shrugged, still processing what had just happened. I figured I didn't have anything to lose. I'm not trying to climb the ladder here. I'm just trying to make things better. Kwan studied him thoughtfully. You know what? That's probably why the colonel listened to you. Everyone else in that room is positioning for their next promotion. You were just telling the truth. She extended her hand. I'd like to be part of your working group if you'll have me. I think we could do something really important here. Jake shook her hand, feeling the beginning of something significant. Welcome aboard. Over the next 3 months, Jake's working group met weekly, developing a comprehensive leadership training program that was radically different from traditional officer education. Instead of focusing on tactics and management theory, it emphasized emotional intelligence, active listening, and the practical skills of building trust with subordinated personnel. They brought in enlisted leaders to share their perspectives on what made officers effective or ineffective. They developed case studies based on real situations that young officers faced. They created mentorship pairings between experienced NCOs and new lieutenants. The program was personal, practical, and built on the fundamental premise that good leadership started with seeing the humanity in everyone you led. When they presented the pilot program to Colonel Stedman, he approved it immediately and expanded its scope. Within 6 months, it would become mandatory for all company-grade officers in the wing. Jake found himself briefing senior leadership, conducting training sessions, and becoming known across the base as the officer who actually understood enlisted concerns. It was gratifying, but also exhausting. He was working longer hours, taking on more responsibility, and feeling the weight of expectations growing heavier. Emma noticed the change. One evening when he came home late again, missing another bedtime, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a serious expression that looked far too old for her 7-year-old face. Daddy, are you going to become one of those officers who forgets about their family? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He sat down across from her, taking her small hands in his. What do you mean, baby? She looked at him with those wise green eyes. Mrs. Chun says that some people get important and forget what really matters. She says success doesn't mean anything if you're alone at the top. Are you going to forget about me? Jake felt tears prick his eyes. He pulled her into his lap, holding her tight. Never, he said fiercely. Emma, you are the most important thing in my life. Nothing I do, no matter how important it seems, matters more than you. I'm sorry I've been working so much lately. That changes starting now. And he meant it. Over the following weeks, Jake restructured his schedule, delegating more to his working group, setting firm boundaries on his availability, and making sure he was home for dinner and bedtime every night except for genuine emergencies. He discovered something surprising. His effectiveness didn't decrease. If anything, it improved. He was more focused during his working hours, more creative in his problem solving, and more present with his team. The Iron Eagle, he realized, didn't have to choose between flying high and protecting its nest. It just had to remember what mattered most and build its life around those priorities. As spring turned into summer, Jake received notification that his promotion to first lieutenant had been approved and that General Hartman would be visiting the base to personally pin on his new rank. The promotion ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in the base theater, a large auditorium normally used for commanders' calls and special briefings. Jake had assumed it would be a small routine event, perhaps a dozen people in attendance, a quick pinning of his new rank followed by handshakes and congratulations. But when he arrived 30 minutes early to check on the arrangements, he was stunned to find the theater filling up with people. His entire section was there, all 35 airmen in dress uniforms. Officers from across the squadron had come. Lieutenant Colonel Chun was in the front row. Members of his leadership working group, including Sarah Kwan, occupied an entire section. Even Colonel Stedman had arrived early, chatting quietly with other senior leaders. and in the third row, beaming with pride, sat Emma and Mrs. Chun. Jake felt overwhelmed by the turnout, by the realization that in less than a year at Peterson, he had somehow built a community that cared enough to show up for him. Rodriguez approached him in the lobby, looking uncharacteristically emotional. "Sir," he said quietly, "the section wanted you to know something. We took a vote last week, unanimous. We want to request that you stay as our section commander for another tour. We know officers usually rotate after a year or 18 months, but we're going to fight to keep you." Jake didn't know what to say. The trust implied in that statement, the respect, it was more meaningful than any medal or commendation could ever be. "Thank you, Sergeant. That means more than you know." The ceremony began with military precision. Colonel Stedman gave opening remarks, speaking about the importance of leadership development and how Jake's work on the training program was already making measurable impacts across the wing. Then he introduced General Hartman, who had flown in specifically for this occasion. Hartman took the stage with the commanding presence that Jake remembered from that first terrible meeting in her office. But when she spoke, her words carried a warmth and authenticity that surprised many in the audience who only knew her reputation as a hard-charging officer. "I'm here today," she began, "not just as the general who approved Lieutenant Reeves's OCS application, but as someone who understands his journey in a very personal way." She proceeded to tell a story that Jake had never heard before, a detailed account of her own path from enlisted mechanic to general officer. She spoke candidly about her mistakes, about the recklessness that had nearly ended her career, about the officer who had given her a second chance when she didn't deserve it. She talked about the shame she had felt, the determination to prove herself, and the gradual transformation from someone who led with ego to someone who led with purpose. The audience was riveted. Many of them had never heard a general officer speak with such vulnerability and honesty. And then Hartman did something extraordinary. She talked about the day Jake had confronted her in her office, about how his words had forced her to confront the person she had become. "I had forgotten where I came from," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the theater. "I had become the kind of officer I once hated, someone who saw rank instead of people, someone who valued credentials over character. And Lieutenant Reeves, when he was still Sergeant Reeves, reminded me of something crucial. He reminded me that the best leaders are the ones who never forget what it's like to be led, who never forget the view from the bottom of the ladder." She paused, her eyes finding Jake in the audience. "Since that day, I've recommitted myself to the values that should have guided me all along. And I've watched this young officer do something remarkable. He's not just excelling at his job. He's changing the culture around him. He's showing what's possible when you lead with empathy and authenticity." Hartman called Jake to the stage. Emma came up too, carrying the small velvet box with Jake's new first lieutenant bars. Jake stood at attention while Emma carefully removed his second lieutenant bars and replaced them with the silver bars of a first lieutenant. Her hands were steady this time, practiced from the last ceremony, but her smile was just as bright. When she finished, she stepped back and saluted her daddy, a gesture she had been practicing at home. Jake returned the salute solemnly, then swept her into his arms as the audience erupted in applause. Hartman shook his hand firmly. "Congratulations, Lieutenant. You've earned this and so much more." Then she leaned in close, her voice low enough that only Jake could hear. "Colonel Brennan would be proud of both of us." Jake felt the weight of that statement, the connection to a legacy that stretched back through generations of leaders who understood that rank was about service, not status. After the ceremony, during the reception in the theater lobby, Jake found himself surrounded by people wanting to congratulate, to share stories about how his leadership had impacted them. Airman Ortiz, the young father Jake had mentored on his first day, approached with tears in his eyes. "Sir, I just want you to know that because of your advice, because you showed me it was possible to be a good airman and a good dad, I'm re-enlisting. I was planning to get out, but I realized I can do this. And I want to do it here under your leadership." Jake embraced the young man, feeling the profound responsibility and privilege of leadership. "That's the best promotion gift you could have given me, Ortiz." "Thank you." Rodriguez appeared with a wrapped package, his weathered face creased in a rare smile. "The section chipped in for this, sir. We wanted you to have something to remember your first year with us." Jake unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a custom-made wooden plaque. At the center was a metal eagle, similar to the one Colonel Brennan had given Hartman. But this one was etched with the names of every airman in Jake's section. Below the eagle was an inscription: "To Lieutenant Jake Reeves, an officer who never forgot where he came from, a leader who showed us what integrity looks like. From the Airman of Vehicle Maintenance, 21st LRS, we follow you because you first walked beside us." Jake couldn't speak. He simply held the plaque, reading each name, feeling the weight of their trust and affection. "This goes on my wall," he finally managed, "right next to Emma's drawings. It's the most important thing I'll ever receive." As the reception began to wind down, General Hartman found Jake standing alone by a window, staring out at the mountains. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Please," Jake said, gesturing to the space beside him. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two officers whose lives had intersected in unexpected and transformative ways. "I need to tell you something," Hartman said eventually. "When you walked into my office that day, when you called me out on my hypocrisy, I was furious. I wanted to have you reprimanded, maybe even discharged, but I went home that night and I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing your words. I kept seeing the disappointment in your eyes, and I realized that you had given me a gift. You had given me the opportunity to become the person I should have been all along." Jake looked at her, seeing not the intimidating general, but the person beneath the rank. You gave me a gift too, ma'am. You could have had me thrown out for insubordination. Instead, you listened. You changed your mind. You gave me my chance. That took courage. Hartman smiled. It took a kick in the ass, which you provided. She turned to face him directly. I've been thinking about succession planning, about what the Air Force will need in its senior leaders 10, 15 years from now. We need more officers like you, Jake. Officers who understand that leadership is about people, not systems. Officers who've walked in both worlds and can bridge the gap between enlisted and officer cultures. So I'm putting you on a pathway: accelerated development, command opportunities, professional military education. If you keep performing the way you have been, you could be a squadron commander in 5 years, a group commander in 10, maybe even a general by the time you're 50. The scope of what she was proposing took Jake's breath away. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. I never imagined reaching that high. You don't have to decide anything today, Hartman said gently. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep being the kind of leader who changes lives. The rest will follow. She placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm betting my reputation on you, Jake. Don't make me regret it. Jake met her eyes steadily. I won't, ma'am. I promise. Hartman left. Jake remained by the window, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from that devastating rejection in Hartman's office to this conversation about a future he had never dared to imagine. He thought about Emma, about the example he was setting for her, about the life they were building together, and he thought about all the airmen he had served with, would lead in the years to come. This wasn't just about his career anymore. It was about changing a culture, about proving that the best leaders could come from anywhere, about creating pathways for others to follow. Emma appeared at his side, tugging on his uniform jacket. Daddy, can we go home now? I want to put your new bars in my memory box. Jake scooped her up, holding her close. Yeah, baby. Let's go home. As they walked out of the theater together, Emma chattering about what she would tell her friends at school, Jake felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his purpose, he had found his place, and he had found a way to honor both his past and his future, to be both the enlisted airman who understood struggle and the officer who could create change. The Iron Eagle had taken flight, and the sky was limitless. 5 years had passed since that promotion ceremony, and the Air Force had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Jake Reeves, now a captain and squadron commander of the 21st Logistics Readiness Squadron, sat in his office reviewing performance reports for his 200 airmen. The office walls told the story of his journey. There was the plaque from his vehicle maintenance section, now accompanied by a dozen similar tributes from other units he had led. Emma's drawing, more sophisticated now at 12 years old, still held places of honor, and prominently displayed on his desk sat the Iron Eagle pin that had started it all. Polished and cherished, a daily reminder of the promises he had made and kept. The leadership development program he had pioneered had expanded across the entire Air Force, adopted as a model for officer training at every level. The culture was shifting, slowly but measurably. Retention rates were climbing. Surveys showed enlisted personnel reporting higher levels of trust in their leadership, and stories were emerging from bases around the world about officers who led with empathy and authenticity, who remembered where they came from, who saw their people as humans rather than resources. Jake's fingerprints were on all of it, though he had never sought credit or recognition. He had simply done the work day after day, airman by airman, decision by decision. A knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. The door opened to reveal General Hartman, now a 3-star general and commander of Air Mobility Command, one of the most powerful positions in the Air Force. Despite her increased rank and responsibilities, she had maintained a personal interest in Jake's career, checking in regularly, offering guidance, and ensuring he received the opportunities he needed to continue growing as a leader. Sir, Jake said, standing quickly and coming to attention. Hartman waved him back to his seat with a smile. Relax, Jake. This isn't a formal inspection. I'm actually here for something else entirely. She settled into the chair across from his desk, and Jake noticed she looked tired, the weight of command evident in the lines around her eyes. I need your help with a problem. Jake leaned forward attentively. Of course, ma'am. Whatever you need. Hartman pulled out a tablet and brought up a report. I've been reviewing data from bases across my command, and I'm seeing a disturbing pattern. We have a growing number of senior enlisted personnel, master sergeants and senior master sergeants, who are struggling with the transition from technical expert to supervisor. They're brilliant at their jobs, but they're failing their people. Morale is suffering, retention is dropping, and I think it's because we've never properly trained them on leadership. We assume that technical competence automatically translates to leadership ability, and it doesn't. She looked at him directly. I want you to design a leadership academy specifically for senior enlisted personnel, something that teaches them what you know, what you've learned through your journey. I want you to show them that being a good leader means seeing people, not just managing processes. Jake felt the weight of what she was asking. Ma'am, that's a massive undertaking. I'm honored you'd think of me, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to design something that comprehensive. Hartman's expression was firm but kind. You're more qualified than anyone I know. You've been both enlisted and officer. You've led at every level from the flight line to the squadron. You've transformed the culture everywhere you've served. And most importantly, you understand that leadership is about service, not authority. She paused. I'm offering you a choice. You can stay here as squadron commander, which you're doing brilliantly, or you can take a special assignment to Air Mobility Command headquarters for a year. Design this academy, train the trainers, build something that will outlive both of us. What do you say? Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. It would mean moving Emma again, disrupting the stable life they had built in Colorado. It would mean long hours and enormous pressure, but it would also mean the opportunity to impact thousands of airmen, to create lasting systemic change, to fulfill the promise he had made to himself and to Colonel Brennan's memory. He thought about all the senior NCOs he had worked with over the years, brilliant technicians who struggled with leadership because no one had ever taught them how. He thought about the airmen who deserved better from their supervisors, and he knew there was only one answer he could give. I'll do it, ma'am. When do I start? Hartman's face broke into a genuine smile. That's what I was hoping you'd say. You report to Scott Air Force Base in 6 weeks. And Jake, this is going to be your legacy. This is how you change the Air Force forever. That evening, Jake sat down with Emma to tell her about the move. She was at the kitchen table doing homework, her long hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face screwed up in concentration over a math problem. She had grown so much in 5 years, transformed from a little girl into a young woman who was confident, intelligent, fiercely independent. She looked up when he sat down across from her, immediately reading his expression. We're moving again, aren't we? Jake nodded. How did you know? She shrugged. You have that look, the one you get when something big is happening. Where are we going this time? Illinois. Scott Air Force Base. I've been asked to develop a training program for senior enlisted leaders. It's a really important project, but it means leaving Colorado, leaving your school and your friends. If you don't want to do this, if it's too much, we can figure something else out. You come first, always. Emma put down her pencil and looked at him with those wise green eyes that still reminded him so much of Rachel. Daddy, I've watched you for 5 years now. I've watched you come home excited about helping people, about making things better. I've heard you on the phone with airmen who call you for advice at all hours. I've seen the letters and emails of lives you've changed. She reached across the table and took his hand. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of what you do. And if moving to Illinois means you can help even more people, then that's what we should do. I'll make new friends. I always do. Besides, she added with a grin, Mrs. Chun says change is how we grow, and I want to grow into someone who makes a difference just like you. Jake felt tears prick his eyes. When did you become so mature? Emma laughed. I've been learning from the best. The move to Illinois happened quickly. Jake and Emma settled into a comfortable house near base, and Mrs. Chun, who had become family in every way that mattered, decided to relocate with them. She wouldn't hear of them doing this alone, she declared, and besides, Illinois had better autumn colors than Texas or Colorado. Jake threw himself into the academy design with characteristic intensity, but he never forgot the lesson Emma had taught him about balance. He worked hard, but he was always home for dinner. He traveled when necessary, but he never missed Emma's important events. He built something extraordinary, but he built his life around the people who mattered most. The Senior Enlisted Leadership Academy opened 18 months later with its first class of 50 master sergeants from across the Air Force. The curriculum was revolutionary, focusing not on technical skills but on emotional intelligence, communication, mentorship, and the practical challenges of leading people through difficult situations. Jake personally taught several of the core modules, sharing stories from his own journey, being vulnerable about his failures and struggles, modeling the kind of authentic leadership he wanted them to embrace. The feedback was overwhelming. The senior NCOs, many of them skeptical at first, opened up in ways they never had before. They talked about their fears, their doubts, their desire to be better leaders, but their lack of knowledge about how to do it. And they learned not from lectures and PowerPoint slides, but from real conversations, practical exercises, and the example of an officer who truly understood their world. On the day of the first class graduation, Jake stood on the stage watching 50 newly trained senior enlisted leaders receive their certificates. General Hartman was there to deliver the keynote address, and her words echoed themes that had become central to Air Force culture. Leadership is not about rank or authority, she said. It's about service. It's about seeing the people you lead as humans with dreams and challenges and infinite worth. It's about remembering where you came from and using that knowledge to lift others up. She looked directly at Jake. The officer who designed this academy understands that truth in his bones. He has lived it, taught it, embodied it. And because of him, because of what he's built here, tens of thousands of airmen will have better leaders. Millions of airmen over the coming decades will benefit from the culture he has helped create. That is a legacy worth celebrating. After the ceremony, as families and graduates mingled in celebration, Jake found a quiet moment alone outside the building. He pulled out the Iron Eagle pin and held it in his palm, thinking about Colonel Brennan, about the chain of second chances and paid-forward kindness that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the scared, grieving sergeant who had been told he was just a grunt, who had almost given up on his dreams. And he thought about the officer he had become, not despite his enlisted service, but because of it. A hand touched his shoulder. It was Emma, now 14 and taller than she had been just months before. "You did it, Daddy," she said softly. "You kept your promise. You changed everything." Jake put his arm around his daughter, pulling her close. "We did it," he corrected. "None of this would mean anything without you. You're my why, Emma. You always have been." They stood together watching the sun set over the Illinois prairie, casting long shadows across the base. Somewhere in the crowd behind them, General Hartman was talking with graduates, sharing her own story of redemption and second chances. Somewhere across the Air Force, officers and NCOs were leading with empathy and authenticity, creating cultures of respect and trust. And somewhere in the future, new leaders were being shaped by the programs and values that Jake had pioneered, carrying forward a legacy that would outlive them all. The Iron Eagle had flown higher than anyone could have imagined, but it had never forgotten the ground where it built its nest. It had proven that true strength came not from authority but from service, not from rank but from character, not from perfection, but from the courage to be vulnerable and human. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all, that anyone, from any background, with any history, could become a leader worth following. All they needed was someone to believe in them, to give them a chance, to show them what was possible. Jake Reeves had been given that chance, and he had spent every day since making sure others received it too. That was his promise. That was his purpose. That was his legacy. The Iron Eagle had truly taken flight, and the skies would never be the same.